So thanks for joining the Safety Roundtable today, and we're going to be talking about a topic close to my heart, clearly, which is slip and fall accidents. And the topic is really around what are the secrets, what are the ways, the methodologies, the principles that you can drive down this type of accident, injury and claim. So what we're going to cover today in brief, I'm going to talk a little bit longer than normal because I know a bit more about this subject possibly than some of the other subjects we've covered, but I think this is one that's a little bit more appropriate for me to do a bit more of the talking. So probably about half an hour. I'm going to go into is slips really that big a problem? If so, why? And then what are the three T's, the three ideas, the three principles that you can follow to reduce this risk? And then, as always, open it up for Q&A if you've got any questions about this, and then sharing what's working for you, where you've had success before or where you've had learnings from trying things that haven't necessarily worked. So a quick intro to me. For anybody that doesn't know me, my name's Christian Harris, and I've got a business called Slip Safety Services. Every week I do three sort of cornerstone bits of content. I do this roundtable every Wednesday morning. On Saturdays, I release the Safety and Risk Success podcast. My guest this week was Louise Hosking, who's the IOSH president. Really good conversation with Louise. And then on a Friday as well, on LinkedIn, I do a newsletter called This Week in Safety and Risk. So I'm pretty prolific when it comes to content stuff. In my day job, I work in the field of slip and fall prevention. I've been involved in some very high profile cases, such as this death in a co-op in Truro. The business has won some awards. We partner with people like AXA, and we've got blue chip clients like Network Rail, do quite a lot of stuff with IOSH in terms of content and presentations and things as well. But I guess what really gets us excited is working with clients. And so in my career in this space over the last 10 plus years, I've helped over 5,000 client sites to drive down slip and fall accidents, injuries and claims. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And at last count, we reckoned we're preventing about £10 million of claims a year for, or helping to prevent our clients from having £10 million of claims a year. So here's the big promise for today's roundtable, which is that you can stop slips. And I'm going to talk to you about how we can do that. Just a few examples, just to prove the point, or to give you some sense of certainty that you can do this. Here's a few client successes that we've had over the years. You'll see that they're in different sectors. You'll see that they're in busy places. You'll see that they've got environments that get wet quite often, like swimming pools and bathtubs. But the thing in common is quite significant reduction in incidents, injuries and claims costs. So it can be done. And it might seem hard, but three reasons to have some cause for comfort. So as you've seen, we've got loads of examples of 50% plus reductions. There's a science to this. It's not stick your finger in the air and hope for the best. There's a proven science. There's ways of measuring all of the different factors you need to consider, so you can actually know that you're getting the inputs right, going back to what we talked about last week between inputs and outputs. And I'm going to share with you the roadmap for how to get to these outcomes today. So the big question to start with, I bang on about slips all the time, obviously, but are slips really that big an issue? So a few data points. These are the RIDDORs reported in the HSE annual statistics for the last 5 years. So what you're seeing is a very consistent picture that around 30% of all accidents at work, or all RIDDORs, are in the category of slips, trips and falls. So the first point is it's quite a big chunk, but B, we're not improving, right? So if anything, in the last year we've got a bit worse. And actually, if you look at other types of incident, we're doing much better than we are in this area. So, from that perspective, there's certainly a question mark as to whether we could improve or not. Here's another interesting data point. We work with AXA Insurance, as I mentioned, and for 2018, they published their health and safety claims data on their website, and slips was far and away the biggest cause of them paying out claims. It was 80 million. The next biggest was manual handling, and trips, which they split out from slips, and an interesting and important point, was not listed, so therefore we must assume that it's far less than 30 million. So slips, trips and falls are often bundled together, but if you look at the data here, and there's other data points as well, slips are the vast majority. I reckon probably about 80% of that category are slips. So if you think of it that way and you look at the 21-22, you're looking at maybe well north of 25% of every single one in every four accident that causes a riddle is a slip. So on that basis, I think it's probably fair to say it's a big issue. Why then do slips happen? And why, I suppose maybe not even why does it happen, but why do they happen? But why do they keep happening? Why have we flatlined? Why are we not seeing an improvement? I put this down to something that I've coined called the slip problem. So these are four kind of misconceptions, misperceptions that people have about slips. I wonder if you've ever heard any of these before or felt any of these. So the first is that slips are simple. So that could sound something like, just stick a yellow sign out and you're fine, or don't worry, the cleaning company deal with that, or words to that effect. So in other words, people think that it's quite a simple problem to solve, and therefore they take simple steps to try and reduce the problem, but lo and behold, that doesn't seem to be working based on the data. So the reality is that slips are more complicated and more complex than most people think. The second misconception is that slips are low cost. So that's, words to the effect of slips aren't very expensive, doesn't matter because our insurance covers us anyway. Let's focus on the big ticket items. And whilst it's fair to say that the average slip claim is only £10,000, as you've seen from AXA, they accumulate into a massive number. Well over £1 billion a year of claims are paid out in the UK each year. So to say that they're low cost, I think is false. There's also criminal fines. There's also the hidden costs, the uninsurable costs, and of course there's a massive human cost. 300,000 plus people a year go to A&E after a slip in the UK. 1.5 million NHS bed days. The next thing we hear is that they're impossible to solve. We're going to debunk that today, but suffice it to say that you can stop slips. And poultry, slips are poultry. In other words, they're insignificant. Yes, a lot of people slip and fall and graze their knee, but every 3 minutes in the workplace there's a broken bone as a result of a slip. There's about a dozen amputations every year. There are deaths. There's brain injuries. There are some severe and significant injuries that are caused by slips. So what we've got to do is break through these misperceptions. We've got to try to myth bust these and get people to think about this with the care and attention that the data suggests it deserves. Good news is there is a better way. There's a lovely sunset coming over the horizon, and I'm going to talk to you about 3 T's, which are 3 principles that you can use to achieve better outcomes in this area. So the first one is tune your CHIMES. So CHIMES is an acronym that I spent a long time with a thesaurus developing. And it's basically the 6 reasons why someone might slip. Or if you look at it on the other side, the flip side, it's the 6 things that you should seek to control better to avoid anybody slipping and hurting themselves. This is what it stands for. So C is for contamination. If you think of a floor that's perfectly clean and perfectly dry, the likelihood of someone slipping on it is very, very low indeed. But as soon as we introduce some kind of contaminant, which could be water, it could be grease, it could be dust, it could be a sheet of plastic, it could be a grape or a tomato, anything that's going on top of the floor and producing a barrier between the foot and the floor is going to change the dynamics and could raise the risk of someone slipping and falling. H is for heel. This is footwear. So clearly for someone to slip, a foot has to hit a floor. So the more slip resistant the floor, the more slip resistant the heel, the less likely the accident is. The thing with heel is that it's not so readily controllable as some of these other CHIMES. So if you're operating a restaurant, for example, and you've got people slipping in your kitchen, then you could put some footwear in place. Whereas if you've got people slipping front of house who are customers, obviously you can't control what they're wearing on their feet. So what you have to do, or the way you have to think about heel, is can we control it? If not, we need to recognise the fact that the heel might not be perfect, and therefore we should put more emphasis on some of these other things to compensate for that. I is individual, so these are all the human factors. So we can all walk on a slippery floor without slipping. But if we're pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, if we're rushing, if we're distracted, if we don't notice that the floor is slippery, then we're more likely to slip and fall. The older you are, the more likely you are to fall, and the more likely you are as well to injure yourself from a fall too. So this is all about the human things. What can we control? How can we influence? How can we persuade people to to reduce risk? M is maintenance, and this broadly splits into three things. The first is kind of change of use. So if you're reconfiguring buildings, that's going to change the dynamics. The second thing is wear and tear. So think of going to a church that's been there for hundreds of years. If you see the floor, you'll see that the floor has worn, and floors do change through wear and tear quite significantly and perhaps more rapidly than people expect. And the third one, and perhaps the biggest, is cleaning. So cleaning can be the difference between a floor being and staying safe, or a floor being safe once and then not being safe in the future. E is environment. So this is things like the weather, but also steps and stairs, slopes and ramps, entrance systems, such as what door types you've got, do you have a canopy, how much matting you've got, all comes under environment, as well as noise, lighting. So quite a big topic to think about. It's kind of around the built environment principally. And then S is surface. Think about walking down the high street along the pavement in the pouring rain. You can do that safely, right? And that's because you've got a floor surface that is safe when wet. If you imagine, however, changing that floor to the type of floor you typically see in a 5-star hotel lobby and having those same weather conditions, quite a lot of people are going to end up on their bottoms, most likely. So some floors are safer than others. So when I run through this CHIMES model with people, I typically get two reactions. One is, I didn't realise there was so much to this subject. Again, going back to that misperception that slips are simple. And the second is, if I'm honest, if I put my hand on my heart, we're probably only looking at one or two of these. We're definitely not looking at all six. So therefore, people can see that there is room for improvement. How should we consider CHIMES then? Basically, what we're showing here is that there's a holistic approach that you need to take to reduce slip and fall risk. You need to understand which of these are controllable and which aren't, and under what circumstances. You need to think about how you can measure them so that you can actually feel as if you are controlling them rather than guessing and hoping for the best. And as I said, it's holistic. So if you can't control one of them, or if your control of one of them is maybe more limited, place more emphasis on the others and overall try to achieve as high a result as you can across these 6 areas. Second principle, second T, is testing your floors. So I'm going to show you a video of this contraption that's in the graphic here. It's called a pendulum test. But the reason to test your floors is that I talked about measuring and quantification, and this is the HSE approved method. It's the method that's approved and used in court cases of scientifically measuring how slip resistant a floor surface is or isn't. And in doing the testing, we actually measure a full 50% of the CHIMES. So by doing this, a slip test, we can understand and measure the level of contamination on the floor and what effect that's having on the slip resistance. We can measure the effectiveness of cleaning and wear and tear. And we obviously get an understanding and a scientific number of the surface as well. So a full half of the CHIMES model can be measured in part using this slip test. So I'm going to show you a video of it being used. What you'll see is that the chap here is going to spray the floor with water. He then releases a foot which swings down from right to left, and that foot is striking the floor, and it's designed to do that in such a way that mimics the heel striking the floor as you're walking. So think about when you're walking, you're placing your heel onto the floor with a fair bit of weight into it. As it swings through, it pushes a pointer onto the gauge on the left-hand side, and that number on the gauge is the result of the test, and I'll tell you what that means in a second. But watch this video and just see if this kind of makes sense to you, that the science of this is mimicking what happens when you strike your heel on the floor. I'll show it to you again, but hopefully that brings it to life a bit and it makes sense. So he's going to spray the floor, release the foot, swings down, pushes the pointer onto the gauge, and it's called a pendulum test because obviously it swings like a pendulum. So that is how the HSE would come in and measure how safe your floor is if in the event of a serious incident. That's how a lawyer would instruct an expert witness. I do some of that work, for example, to come in and measure the floor in the event of a claim. So that's how you should be doing it as well. And what I would say is this: without this data, you're only really guessing. And as I'll show you an example shortly, guessing is not really a very good strategy when it comes to this, or not, maybe not guessing, but assumption. So assuming that your floor is safe, assuming that your floor is clean, assuming that it's performing as well as it did 3 or 4 years ago is a recipe for disaster. The output of the test, as I said, is a number which is called a pendulum test value. There's a traffic light system. So anything from 0 to 24 is a high risk, 25 to 35 moderate risk, 36 plus low risk. And you can take that a step further and you can correlate it to accident risk exposure. So if you look here on the right-hand side, you'll see that with a pendulum test value of 36, you've got a 1 in a million risk exposure. Whereas if you go down towards the left with a pendulum test value of 24, you've got a 1 in 20 risk exposure. Now, that doesn't mean that for every 20 people that walk across a floor, one of them will slip, but it means that 1 in 20 people is exposed to that risk. They have that risk that they might slip, if that makes sense. So if you've got a floor that scores a PTV of 24 and it's in an area of the building that is constantly getting wet or contaminated, such as a swimming pool, a kitchen, a toilet, a hotel bathroom, an entrance area, then you as the building operator, if you've got that floor in that condition and it's constantly getting wet or contaminated, you're relying on 5% of the people using that floor to do something themselves in order not to suffer from a slip and a fall. Whereas if you're up at the green end, you're only relying on 1 in a million people walking across that floor needing to do something themselves in order not to slip. So if you're anything like me, you'd like to be on that green end of things. So the testing helps you to figure out where you are, and then why that is. Going back to CHIMES, is it the floor? Is it wear and tear? Is it cleaning? Is it contamination? We can figure all of that out. And then the idea is, let's try and move you as far down to the right into that green zone as we possibly can. Third T is take the scorecard. So I've developed a self-assessment tool, a digital self-assessment tool. It's free to use. It takes 3.5 minutes on average. And basically you answer a series of questions and it'll give you a score for each of the CHIMES. You get your results instantly, and you also get a 30-page report sent to you telling you what your score is for the CHIMES and then where you can look to improve. Everybody that does that as well can have a 15-minute consultation with me on Zoom to chat through the results and deep dive and figure out what can be done. But the idea here is to do some risk scoring. So rather than again assuming, we now know that we've got this CHIMES framework. Use the scorecard to figure out, okay, how are we scoring on each of the CHIMES, and then you can start to see where you're strong, which is great. Keep up the good work. Where you can improve, okay, let's figure out what we can do to improve, and again try to achieve that holistic outcome of good scores. So here's an example of some aggregated results from the laundry industry. So I did a talk similar to this a few months ago for an industry association for the laundry industry, and a number of the people in advance of that talk were asked to take the scorecard, and this is how they scored as an industry. So you can see that they've got some quite good scores in a number of categories. So H for heel, they're scoring very well indeed. I guess that's because they know that their floors are likely to get wet or contaminated because of the type of environment they're in. There's always going to be condensation and things like that. So they're putting safety footwear in. But what you can see is obviously there's room for improvement in two areas straight away, individual and surface, whereby if they could just improve those two areas, then they're going to be reducing the risk quite significantly. If they had everything at 70-odd%, that's a pretty good result. So without doing the scorecard, they never would have known where to focus their time and effort to get the improvements that they needed. They could have been spending a lot of time on heel. Actually, they were doing pretty good there. They could have been spending a lot of time on contamination. Actually, they're doing pretty well there. But unbeknownst to them, they'd be struggling on individual and surface. So the scorecard is a great way of just figuring out where you are and then giving you an idea of where to focus your time and effort to improve. So I'm just going to see if this works. Let's see if it works. I was just going to show you how it works. It didn't seem to want to open from. There we go. It didn't want to open from when I was doing the presentation. So this is the page that you go to, and there's loads of information there. But I think I'm going to cut this down a bit. But you click on here, fill in a few details. So I'll just put my details in for now. And then just to show you how it looks, and then literally you're answering a series of questions like this for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then you are getting, as you can see, you can go through these very, very quickly, and then you're getting your results. So I'd certainly recommend you do that. So if you pull all of that together, if you go through that process, and then if you then use that knowledge, the data, and the frameworks to pull everything together into a strategy, it's more than possible to achieve a 57% plus reduction using that 3T system. So just starting to wrap up then, why should we do this? Why should we take this more seriously? Well, we've seen the data. But the first thing to look at in terms of looking at this strategy is to reduce the risk and accident frequency. So here's an example from a leisure centre. I know Andy Reid who's joined us today comes from that background. This isn't one of his former centres, but this is a leisure centre, and the assumption, the conclusion that the general manager of this leisure centre had was that we've got an anti-slip floor and therefore we don't need to worry about slips because we've got a textured anti-slip floor, as you can see in the photograph. So we went in and did a slip test, and then we just gave one of those tiles a bit of a clean, just out of interest. So you can see a bit of a difference there, I think it's fair to say. But interestingly, when we tested the floor as it was, in wet conditions, it had a high risk of slip. So there is a textured floor, but because of the contamination, because of the efficacy or lack thereof of the maintenance, that floor has become slippery over time. When we cleaned the floor properly and removed all that contamination, actually what was proven is that the floor itself, the surface, was safe because when it was slip tested in that clean condition, it had a low risk of slip. So they were right in thinking they did have an anti-slip floor, but they were incorrect in thinking that just because they've got an anti-slip floor, that's all they needed to worry about, because the floor is only going to perform as well as it's cared for. Just think if you're going to the dentist and the hygienist, or taking your car for a service and an MOT. The second reason that this is really important is if you go through this process, if you get some of this data, particularly the slip testing data, you're in a really strong position to defend claims. So David Scott, I interviewed on my podcast that I mentioned at the start, and we were talking here about a swimming pool, interestingly, where if somebody slips and the floor is wet and they really hurt themselves, are they entitled to make a claim? Or of course they're entitled to make a claim, but will they succeed in making a claim? And David's strong answer is no, and he defends claims for the likes of Virgin Active and Bourne Leisure, who operate Butlins, for example. If you're the operator of a building and you can document and prove that you're taking this seriously, and particularly if you've got that slip testing data which shows that the floor was compliant, so in other words it was achieving the right score when it was wet, and provided that that testing data is current, so within the last 12 months, you should expect to defend that claim. So to summarise then, you know, we've talked a bit about some of the human costs of this. We've talked about lots of people going to hospital. We've talked about the fact that taking quite a simplistic approach isn't enough. We've talked about the costs, and including the uninsured costs of the accident iceberg. So I think, you know, it's a big enough problem that merits some work. We've given you a framework to have a look at that and to try to address some of these risks. And hopefully you found that useful. So thanks for joining me on that. I've hit my half an hour time cue perfectly. So now I'd love to open it up to the floor and have a chat, as we always do. So any questions you've got, any clarifications, I'd love to know what your experience is of slips in your businesses, how you're controlling them, what you've learnt, and yeah, we can open it up to a chat. So I think I saw a couple of questions in the chat box. Andy, observation. So you find in leisure centres that new floors are less slip resistant than older floors. Ironic. Yeah, that's ironic. I think that people, what's one of the key times to get a slip test is when you're putting a new floor in, because you want to make sure that that floor is compliant. And again, you don't want to guess, because what we see a lot with new floors is that people might choose the right floor, but then it could get installed. But if it isn't cleaned effectively as part of the installation and the handover, then that floor can be just as slippery as if you'd put a smooth floor in to start with. So I do think that that's a key time to think about doing a slip test. Awuma, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Hi.
I was on my name is Uchuaipo. and I work in a construction company in Nigeria here. And the construction company is based on oil and gas. We install pipelines and all of that. And I enjoyed the section, as I wrote in the chat section. I enjoyed the round table discussion, but I wanted to find out, because most of your examples here on floors, what happens in the construction company where activities like excavation takes place? And in Nigeria here, sometimes during the rainy season, it can be very, very hard controlling sleep. So, but I didn't see any of your recommendations for the sleep in such areas. So how do we go about it? Like I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. It's a ground, not like a floor, like the soil itself.
Yeah, so if you're sort of not on a tiled floor or a resin floor or something, but you're out and about, in the real world, on different floors, and so you can't control the floor, in other words.
Yeah, so that's my question. So how do we go about it? Because it's a really big issue. Sometimes the safety issues even slip on this, especially when the floor is muddy, and then we wait overnight and we resume work the next day. So what do we do with such cases?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. It's a question I had recently from somebody at Network Rail as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go back to this slide. So I would still always revert back to CHIMES, irrespective of where a slip would happen. I'd always revert back to CHIMES, and I'd start to try and do a bit of a deep dive and think about, what can we control in that particular area, and what can't we control. And if there's things we can't control, then we need to do more on the things that we can. So surface in that scenario is one that you can't really control, because if you're walking across the ground, and it's by a train track, or it's on an oil field, or it's in a mine, or wherever it is, or it's on some grass, or if you're delivering a package to someone's house, if you're an Amazon driver or an Ocado driver or whatever, you can't really control the surface. So I would be placing a lot of emphasis there on heel, because obviously that is controllable, and you can find the best possible footwear for that type of terrain and the type of surface that you're going to be walking upon. And I'd be thinking a lot about individuals. So I'd be training people on what to look for. I'd be even training them potentially, if you're finding that a lot of people are falling and you really can't control a lot of other things, you can train people how to fall safely, right? If you think about martial arts and things like that. I'd be thinking about things like environment as well. So depending on when you're in those areas, it might be that lighting is an issue. So could you think about things like torches, for example, so that people can see more readily and see what's on the floor. So there's always stuff you can do, but in that scenario you've sort of asked about, you're limited on which of the CHIMES you can control. So therefore, I think you've got to go deep and strong on the ones that you can. Does that make sense?
Yes, Marissa, thank you. I would like to also find out if the sleep test is also applicable in such cases.
Sorry, is the slip test?
If the slip test is applicable, like, can you also test the ground?
So you could test anything. Is the slip test applicable on the ground? I mean, you could the slip test was well. Firstly, different countries have different tests that they recognise. So in the UK, in the law and by the HSE, it's that particular test. If you go to America, it's very different. But if you think about that particular test, the pendulum test, that was actually designed to measure skid resistance of cars on roads all those years ago. So it can be used to test all manner of surfaces. You probably wouldn't be able to test like on some soil, for example, because you need to be able to plant the foot in a predetermined distance to get a valid test. But if it was tarmac, then you could absolutely do it. You can test any other kind of surface from from wood to glass to metal to everything in between. So I would have a look at what the test would be, if it's an oil field in the country that you're in. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, are people slipping or are they tripping? And try and do a bit of root cause analysis on that question as well, because obviously the way that you deal with a slip is detailed and scientific. The way you deal with a trip is very different, but it's kind of more shallow, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How often are we to do a slip test?
So, and actually, Simon's asked that question in the chat as well. So, how long is a slip test valid? So, how often should we do a slip test, and how long are they valid? So, my experience is that if you've got a test that is if you're standing up in court or dealing with an insurance company, if you've got a test that's any more than 12 months old from the date of the accident, it's not very valid, because things can change so quickly. You could make a theoretical argument that a slip test is invalid the very next day, and that I'm sure Richard is on the call. My colleague from Ireland, he works in this field, could easily support that argument as well. But obviously, you can't be expected to slip test every single floor every single day. So I would say that sort of annually, is something that's reasonable, it's practicable, and in the UK, health and safety law, that's what we're asking people to do: take reasonable and practicable steps. So annually, I would say is meets that test, meets that benchmark. Anything less than that, it's quite hard to say. Is that reasonable? Anything more frequent than that, that could be good. But I would say it's not necessarily, needed. Just quickly, because it's 22, I just want to share what we're going to be talking about next week, and then I've got happy to take as many more questions or comments as we want to. Let me just pull this up. So next week, we're gonna put the cat among the pigeons, and we're going to talk about the good old safety is our number one priority statement, and we'll deep dive into that, and it'd be interesting to get your view on this. I'm sure we'll probably be of one mind, but what we're talking about here, and my proposition is that that's a myth, but actually how can we make that into a reality? And then the other thing quickly is if particularly, given the topic of today, if you do feel you've got some room for improvement in the world of slips, trips and falls, and you'd like to have a chat with me, then there's a link here to a website, and you can book in a time, and it will stick sort of 45 minutes in the diary, and we can have a chat and see if there's anything that I can help you with. So if that's of interest, then do book on in. What I'll do, I'll put the address for that in the chat, and then Richard, I see you've got your hand up.
Good morning, Christian. Good morning, everyone. It's just in relation to the validity of the 12-month pendulum test. Okay, when an accident happens, it can typically take a long time for the claim to go through, and then the insurance company or whoever will come along and do a test. That can be well outside of that 12-month period. So how do you feel that test data that the insurance company, whether for the claimant or for the defence, how is that valid when it's such a long time after when the initial accident happened?
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's a conversation I have all the time with lawyers and insurers. I mean, what I would always say is that people should be doing this proactively, regularly in advance, so they've got the data before an incident happens. But you're quite right to say, I mean, think of an example recently. I was asked to go and investigate an accident in a pub, and it was about 2.5 years since the accident happened. And really, we can learn something from that slip test. We can learn, for example, if the floor were to be a very smooth, shiny, slippery floor. And irrespective of how we cleaned it 2.5 years later, it was slippery when wet, and it was in the toilet of a pub, and the floor hadn't been changed in 2.5 years, then you could draw a conclusion based on that data that it was smooth, shiny, and slippery back then, and it didn't meet the requirement back then. But if conversely you got to the site and the floor was in a decent condition on the day, that doesn't necessarily mean that 2.5 years ago it was. So I think the benefit of doing a test, after the event some years later, don't know what your view is, Richard, but I think there's limited benefit. You can learn some things from it, but it isn't going to tell you everything you need to know necessarily.
Yeah, I just feel there is an element of swimming pools, especially, where it can change over such a short period of time, where I just don't see the relevance of testing 2 years later and saying that this is how the floor was 2 years prior, because it genuinely can change over a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of further discussion that needs to be had on that.
Yeah. I do think taking a swimming pool, if you go in and it achieved, a very good slip resistance in the wet 2.5 years later, and they hadn't changed the floor, then that would give, at least that proves that the floor surface is a good inherent floor surface. So that does tick a bit of a box, but it doesn't answer all the questions around all of those 6 areas, as you say.
Yeah, because if they want to get a better picture, they need to test that floor in the as found condition.
Yeah.
And a deep clean needs to be done, because that's what possibly could have been done at the time 2 years previous.
Yeah.
To then understand whether that floor is where it should be, or is it now fully contaminated and unsafe.
Yeah. And that's how we would do it, or we do it. We always test the floor as it is, and then all those results go in. And then we would give it a thorough clean as well to try to determine, what is the inherent value of the floor. And I don't know what you do if you get involved in any of these types of claims. We always do that full process, and we present all of that data, and then we're often asked to comment on our view. But obviously, the answer is that you can't be 100% certain about what was there 2.5 years ago. But yeah, you can learn. I think you can learn some relatively useful things. Simon, how are you today?
Not so bad, thanks yourself.
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Thank you very much for another interesting roundtable discussion. One final question from me: is there a test to determine how good a heel is? If you are, when you're doing the tests, assume using like sort of the perfect heel.
Yeah.
What stage does wear affect the likelihood of a slip?
Yeah.
It's also guidance. I've got some walking boots that are really quite old, but they're really comfortable and they tend to do the job. But probably down 1/4 of the heel, it's a bit worn, and more so than another. So it's the way people walk, how it affects their heels. They might think the grip on the 3/4 of the sole is perfect.
Yeah. So there are ways of testing the slip resistance of footwear. So just winding back slightly, when we're doing the slip testing of the floor, we use 2 different rubber sliders to mimic the heel. One is for a barefoot and one is for a shod foot. So if we're talking about a shod environment, we're just testing an average type of sole with the test, because obviously you've got to have a consistency within the test for it to be a valid test. The HSE has developed a way of testing footwear which they call grip. So a lot of footwear manufacturers are doing that, but that could be done on a piece of footwear that is, your walking boots, for example. You could take those into Buxton and get those tested. What I would say is there isn't a sort of commercially viable way of doing that at scale at the moment, like there is with the pendulum slip test. For us to come and do a pendulum test on 6 areas of a floor of flooring in a building is 500 quid plus VAT, so that's fine. For you to send your 1 pair of shoes to HSE for them to do that test, God knows what they charge you, but it'd probably be 4 figures or more, because that's just, you know, the way that they charge for things. So there are ways of testing the heel, and it's always important, if there is an accident, to take as many photographs as you can, including of the footwear that the people were wearing, because, you know, if somebody's wearing you know, very old tatty shoes with worn away soles, then there may well be an argument about contributory negligence in the event of a claim.
You could do likewise with like sort of high heels and.
Yeah, I mean, high
Yeah,
heels
bring
is
it in an office
is
space.
an interesting one, because I think quite often I hear people say, "Oh well, of course, I'm gonna generalize here, because, you know, in the past this would be almost 100% the case. I know things are a bit different now, but of course that lady slipped because she was wearing high heels." Well, hold on a sec. If you're operating a restaurant or a pub or a nightclub or a shopping centre, you've got to expect people to be wearing high heels. You can't ban high heels. So you've got to make your environment safe, such that people would be reasonably expecting to use it. Now, if they're wearing high heels and they're drunk and they're jumping between benches, and, you know, then that's a different matter. But if they're just walking normally and they have got high heels on, your obligation should be to make the building safe, such that somebody could safely do that. So I think quite often we jump to blame the person. There's always somebody responsible for slipping, but it's not normally the person that slips. It sometimes is, but it's normally somebody's made a decision somewhere else and they haven't done something, or they've overlooked something, and that's actually the person that, in my view, is ultimately responsible.
Thank you very much.
Good stuff. Well, look, it's 10:02, so I think probably wrap up, unless anybody wants to put their hand up or unmute and ask any questions. But if not, then thank you very much, as always, guys, for joining. Do come back next week, and we'll talk about safety as our #1 priority, and delve into that can of worms a little bit. Do take the scorecard. Do book in a time to have a chat if you want to talk about slips. You know, that's what I do day in, day out. So if you've got any buildings of your own, or if you've got any clients that might need any help with slips, then I'd love to chat that through with you. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you all next week.